from a South African perspective, we had to go to the army. We were conscripted as youngsters from the age of 18, and we had to spend 2 years in the army and got to see the country from that perspective as well. And you would have tribal wars, the tribal wars and what they called faction fights. And even in the townships with the political situation happening with regards to them fighting for their freedom as well, you'd have different factions like the Inkatha Freedom Party and the African National Congress. And there would be wars between the two of them, and there would be a bit of violence between the two of them. The police were quite hated by the black people in those days. Not the army so much, but the police, because there were some things happening where the police killed some of them, and it was pretty intense, kind of tough situation, even for the black people living in those environments, to this day. It's tough. It's a lot of crime, but some wonderful people as well. I call it steel sharpen steel sessions. When we can sit with each other and we can reflect and sharpen each other to get better, man.
Yeah.
And you guys are a great country. You are a great country, man. And I love coming there, and I want to come there again. I'm just hoping that that election is the right turnout for you guys, because I believe it's going to be massive, the impact on whatever happens there. Not only you guys, we need it in the world. We need the right person to come through there.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the San Diego Patriots Podcast, episode 24. My guest today is Lieben. He's 57 years old. He was born and raised in South Africa and currently lives in Cape Town, which is on the southwest region of the continent. I was most interested in speaking with Lieben because, similar to myself, he loves his country and wants to do his part to improve it. While South Africa is different from the United States, we have a lot in common. Both countries have seen political unrest for the past decade and a growing divide between those who are proud of their nation and its history and those who are ashamed of it and want to see it reformed. In this conversation, we discuss his experience serving in the South African Army, including the horrors of senseless violence and how that shaped him as a man. We discuss life before the end of apartheid, including violence between the South African police and Black communities, as well as violence within the Black communities from one tribe against another. We discuss the similarities between South African townships and the progressive ghettos here in America, such as Harlem, Compton, and the South Side of Chicago. We discuss how the ruling political party, the African National Congress, has devolved in the recent decades into corruption, weaponizing racial grievances for political power. More importantly, we discuss the negative impact that this has had on both their country and its economy. Towards the end, we discuss the importance of the US presidential race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We discuss how this can impact the entire world, both for better or for worse. As we wrap up, we discuss the importance of having dialogue with one another and trading ideas. While many of us may have different political views, we can only improve our society by speaking up against tyranny and engaging in dialogue amongst the people. I had a ton of fun. I learned a lot in this discussion. I'm very grateful for Lieben's time and his wisdom, and I hope you can all benefit just as I did. Thank you. So I appreciate you joining, Lieben.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me, and thanks for reaching out to me, man.
Totally. Yeah, and we're as some of my viewers will notice, you are not an American with your accent, or an accent for us, but we, funny enough, met each other about 6 months ago. We both work in the software space. I won't mention any company names, but it was actually your first visit to the United States, correct?
Yeah, it was my first visit to the United States, and yeah, I came in via Atlanta and then straight to Vegas, and I loved
Good
every
city to
minute
go
of it,
to.
man.
Yeah.
I loved every minute of it. Sure, I really did. I got to come back to America again.
Yeah, well, you got at least one pal in California now. Um, but but yeah, so we met about 6 months ago, and I think we just kind of hit it off. These days I'm so busy with work, but typically when I come across other people who are patriotic, love their country, and it sounded like, based on the conversations we had, we shared a lot of the same views in terms of kind of some of our concerns about where the world is headed, and some ideas that maybe we don't necessarily agree with, that have become very popular, and something that, I don't know, there's this term called like the silent majority that are now are kind of starting to speak up against some of the craziness we've seen both in the political or economic sphere. But I really enjoyed our conversation, and you being in South Africa, I'll let you do a kind of a quick intro for yourself, but I just really admired that we share a lot of the same views, and there's a lot of similarities between the United States and South Africa. So, you being older than myself, I hope that there's something that I can learn and my viewers can learn about, how we can be stronger men and, how we can better, support and advocate for our country. But again, appreciate your time and would love maybe a kind of a quick intro of yourself for anyone watching.
Great stuff. Thanks, Lee. Okay, so let me shoot off then, man. My name's Lieben. I was born back in 1967, so that tells you guys I'm 57 years old. I was born in a town called Durban, which is on the east coast of South Africa. That's where I spent most of my years as a youngster. Come from a family of five. I've got two brothers and two sisters, and yeah, a pretty big family that have kind of just grown from my brothers and sisters having grandkids and moved all around the world. I have a brother in the UK at the moment. I have a brother in New Zealand. My own son is in New Zealand as well. I've been married for 35 years and I have two wonderful children. I have a son, Lieben Jr., of 32 and a daughter of 24. Her name's Kayla, and really blessed. My wife's name is Fulma, and she's from a place called Bloemhof, which is inland in South Africa. And she grew up, inland in the farms and that side of things. And yeah, man, from a work perspective, um, from a South African perspective, we had to go to the army. We were conscripted as youngsters from the age of 18, and we had to spend 2 years in the army. And then after that, another few months at a time with something we called camps. Got to see the country from that perspective as well, traveling with the army. And then, starting my career in the IT space, working in the banking environment when automated teller machines still came in, the big IBM processors, and started off as a network controller, eventually moving my way up into an executive position in a large company, managing a lot of people. My passion is people. My passion is impacting lives in all spheres, not only in the workspace, but on a daily basis, One thing I just love is being able to impact people positively on a daily basis and care about people. I love people, and yeah, everything happens through people. So yeah, that's me, Lee, and briefly and in a hurry.
Yeah. No, I love it. And there's a lot of questions I have, especially joining the military and kind of the skill sets you learned and, how you transition into the professional life. But one thing I wanted to note too, so we added each other on social media, and you're a big surfer. That's huge out in San Diego, where Southern California, where I am. I mean, have you been doing that
Yeah,
your whole life? Where you were surfing out in Durban? That's another coastal city, right?
yes. Yeah, man. So the ocean's a big part of my life, from a youngster, growing up right next to the ocean. So, surfing, surf ski, paddling. I did a lot of canoeing as well in rivers, as a sport, competitively as well. Took part in a sport called wave ski surfing. I don't know if you know it. They're actually having the world champs here at the moment in South Africa, but it's a kind of sport. It's surfing waves. It's the same score as surfing, but you're sitting down on a craft, epoxy craft that's really light. I surfed in the world champs. From that perspective, got my provincial colors, and then I moved on to stand-up surfing, bodyboarding, it all. I just love the ocean, love fishing. Had a few boats myself, and taking my kids out on the water. Yeah, just being able to, just ocean's a big part of my life. Like I say, Lee, it just feeds my soul every day, man.
Yeah. You know what I always admire about South Africans, very similar to Australians. I mentioned to you, I have a sister who's been living in Australia for about 10 years now, but the love for nature and animals, right? You guys have a massive,
Yeah,
ecosystem for animals, and you have, the
wow, man.
African, Sahara, and, different animals
Yeah,
out there.
we blessed.
So,
We
yeah.
yeah, we blessed, Lee. We blessed with animal life here, man, and wildlife. As you know, we got the big five here. We got a massive variety of birds. It's something I take interest in too. I brought my kids up knowing the bird life, knowing what birds are what, by name, and what they do. From raptors to all kinds of birds. And then I do a bit of hunting myself.
Mhm.
And when I hunt, I only hunt for the pot. I don't go around just shooting lots of animals for the fun of it, but I enjoy the hunt. I enjoy the bush. Grew up that way too. Was fortunate. I had uncles who farmed in South Africa, and many of my school holidays were spent on those farms. Hunting and fishing, and so yeah, the bush, wildlife is a big part of what we do, and just I just appreciate it.
Yeah.
Every day we see it around us, and it's we're just blessed from that perspective, Lee.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to have that care and respect for animals, and I don't know if that's something that's diminishing a bit these days with the younger generation, but, my dad was always very delicate with animals and always taught us to, if we see an injured animal, try to take it in and, repair
Yeah.
it and help, let it fly off again after a few days. So something that I think really shaped my childhood, but I just admire that about the South African society and, you know, so, um, so I was curious. So, you started off in Durban, and then did you join the military? Because right now you live in Cape Town. Like, were you brought there because of the military? And you also mentioned a mandatory military service. I don't know if it's still like that today, but other countries like South Korea, Singapore, Israel, they do a mandatory military service. So I didn't know that until I talked to you about South Africa.
Oh yeah, as a youngster growing up in South Africa, you knew, you were going to go into the military. So my own dad, he was in the South African police, and even while I was growing up, my dad used to go for long periods of time, um, to our borders like Rhodesia and the Caprivi Strip in Southwest Africa, to
And
basically fight a war.
Rhodesia's Zimbabwe now, right?
Yeah, so Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now, So my dad would go away for long periods of time. And at that time, we were, Cuba were coming into Angola, and our borders were threatened as South Africa by communists, basically, you could say. And, as you know, there was apartheid in South Africa, which I don't agree with, but we were brought up in that environment. We kind of were born into it. And, you could say kind of, yeah, it was just you accepted that because that's what you were born into, and you kind of just growing up, and as you got older, and as the world was putting pressure on South Africa from that perspective, we kind of knew, this isn't right, and we needed a change. But I mean, we could talk for a long time around that. But to answer your question, Lee, yes, so we had to do military service right up until 1994, when Nelson Mandela was released,
Mhm.
we had to do military service as white South Africans. Black South Africans didn't have to do military service, but as white South African boys, we had to go to the military once we left school. And if we didn't go or we refused to go, you were basically locked up. You'd be locked up for 3 years. You'd go to prison for 3 years. So we had to do it. Um, and when I say prison, it was what they call a detention barracks. It wasn't like a prison for criminals. You know what I'm saying? It was a detention barracks where peaceful protesters and that were kept. And it was frowned upon, obviously, because we were brought up. We were basically protecting our country from terrorists. Our borders were threatened. Our livelihoods were threatened. Yeah, we believed. Um, and that's what we were born into. So yeah, I went straight out of school into the military. I went to a place called 5 South African Infantry Battalion in Ladysmith, and from there to a place called Infantry School in Oudtshoorn, which is a junior leader instructor base. And that's from there I went on to the dog unit, up in Bergsluk in the Eastern Transvaal. So yeah, it was different. It's something I'm really glad I did, but I wouldn't want to do again, or maybe I would, but it was tough. You had 2 years of your life taken away from you, but as youngsters, we just knew we had to get on and do it. So we're very fortunate. It helped me, I believe, as a person. It instilled some really strong qualities in me. I did some tough things and pushed myself to limits that I never ever thought I would be able to. Being at infantry school, it's kind of a special forces. wouldn't say special forces, but an elite unit within the South African Defence Force.
Yeah.
And yeah, and yeah, I did the 2 years, was fortunate enough to go around the country, like I say, Oudtshoorn, Bergslaag, saw some beautiful places, and also some terrible things. I was fortunate enough, I got injured in my stay in the military. Um, and for 3 months I was pretty much out of it. In hospital, but then I came back and I went straight back into it again, and that's where I was sent to the dog unit in the Eastern Transvaal, where it was pretty beautiful area, and we kind of worked with dogs and spur, we ran tracking with pack hounds and things like that. So as a youngster, it was a great adventure, Um,
Yeah.
and then coming out of the military, I stayed in Durban, and when you came back out of that, you had to do camps, what we called camps. So every year you would be called out for 2 months or 3 months, and you would have to go and do your military service again. So you would be deployed into what we call the townships, or you would be deployed to the border, um, where you would go back straight into military way of doing things. And I did
And
five
that's
of
just where they
those.
needed most of the resources, right? That's where they needed kind of the men on the border and then the townships. Do you
Townships,
mind
yeah,
summarizing townships? Because I know I did some research on it, but maybe it may be newer to some
yeah.
American
So
folks.
So in South Africa, with apartheid and that, you kind of had different areas, and I think all around the world today, you kind of get areas where you'll have a lot of black people staying from specific ethnicity groups, and in South Africa, your two biggest ethnicity groups then were your blacks and your whites. Okay, obviously the blacks are a lot more people from a majority perspective,
It's
but
about ten
they
percent
kind
of
of
South Africa is white, I believe, right? 9 to 10%.
yeah, I think it's even less. It's getting less, Lee.
Mhm.
If I look at the stats now, but it was about 10, 12% at one stage. Um, and yeah, right from the outset, maybe just a bit of history too. When my ancestors landed here, I come from German descent, I come from Dutch descent, and I come from British descent. Okay. And as you know, there were wars in South Africa where the Dutch and the British fought each other, and some hectic wars, and I'm talking in the 1800s and that, and my families were all involved in that. And even from a German perspective, my ancestors didn't, arrive from Germany here in the 1700s. So before, whatever happened in Nazi Germany or whatever, they weren't part of that, but they were here in South Africa. They'd come across by ship, Dutch ancestry and then British ancestry as well. In the Second World War, my grandfather, my mom's father, met my grand from England there. She was a nurse and he was fighting in the First World War, sorry. And, so that's where my British ancestry comes from. So, pretty diverse from that perspective. But sorry, Lee, to get back to your question around the townships, right? So I'm just, yeah, so you had these big areas where people stayed, in the townships. And you know, a lot of the black people would live in what we call the township. And then there were various factions within the black people too, because they're quite tribal. Even from the days when my dad was a young policeman, he was on mounted horseback, and he would be in an area called the Tugela Ferry, Msinga, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. And you would have tribal wars, the tribal wars and what they called faction fights. And even in the townships, with the political situation happening with regards to them fighting for their freedom as well, you'd have different factions like the Inkatha Freedom Party and the African National Congress. And there would be wars between the two of them, and there would be a bit of violence between the two of them. The police were quite hated by the black people in those days. Not the army so much, but the police, because, there were some things happening where, the police killed some of them, and it was pretty intense, kind of tough situation, even for the black people living in those environments, to this day, it's tough, it's a lot of crime, a lot of people, but some wonderful people as well, so but yeah, so a township basically is a massive area that's kind of usually out of the city, and it has its own ecosystem where, they people survive, doing their thing, getting on with life and working. A lot of the people in South Africa, the men were worked on the mines, and had these big, what they called uh, not compounds, but hostels where you had a lot of men staying, and the women a lot of times kind of stayed in the rural areas or the township, and the men had their own hostels and these big compounds where they would stay. And you can imagine sometimes the violence that would erupt there with the different factions and different thoughts and supporting different political parties and different agendas. So yeah, man. That's kind of what a township is. It's just a large area, like call it like a suburb or where people stay, and some are more hectic than others.
Yeah. Yeah, from what I understand, it's very similar. Sometimes you hear the word like the ghettos, right? Like it's these impoverished parts of town,
Yes.
right, that are live in very rough conditions. And typically, of course, there's good people living there, but there's also a lot of crime, organized
Yeah.
crime, and street gangs. Like here in the United States, we have like if you go to Chicago, Chicago is a very big city. A lot of money there. It's booming, heavily populated, but if you go to the south side of Chicago, it's, people are dying every day from gun violence and, street gangs shooting each other, spraying machine
Yeah.
guns into neighborhoods. And, it's sad because you have, poor single moms trying to raise their kids and they have nowhere that, they can't afford living anywhere else. So, there's so it's really crappy, right? And you see
Yeah,
military,
it's
or you see
crappy.
the police come in, they don't like the police. And then over time, the police don't like them so much because they're also dying trying to help resolve some of this, violence. So it's definitely a human phenomenon, and I see a lot of similarities with
Yeah.
the townships in South Africa, similar to our impoverished kind of ghetto communities here in the United States.
Yeah, and they even exist to this day. Those townships are still there, Lee. Obviously with South Africa becoming a democratic country now, everybody can stay wherever they want to. So the middle class and the black people has risen considerably, their lifestyle and lots of has changed to the positive for them, black empowerment, economic empowerment, and certain legislation that was passed here in this country. So, you know, things have improved hugely for many of them.
Mm-hmm.
But still, those townships are still there. I would say the violence is not it's not as bad as it used to be. Um, but still it's pretty violent in those areas. There's areas like anywhere in the world, you know, even
Yeah.
here in Cape Town where I'm at, we have a large colored community here in Cape Town and a lot of gangsterism. And so, the army was brought in to keep the peace often and to just keep law and order. And that's what we were part of. And as youngsters, saw some hectic stuff, as a youngster of 18 and having to come back, 20 years old, 2 years of your life, and you see some hectic stuff. You got to work through some stuff because, you have certain fears that are built up in you by what you've seen and things like that. And yeah, you had to work through that to get over that, and get on with your life.
Yeah. Do you mind? I mean, of course, you feel free to decline, but do you mind sharing some of those stories? Because I know, like here in the U.S., not we have a diminishing military recruitment, right? Like I knew people, me living in San Diego, we have a massive Marine base and a Navy base, so I knew a lot of people who went into the military. Sometimes they get shipped overseas, sometimes they don't, and usually the ones who were more in combat saw some pretty, horrific things, which then they had to kind of it shaped them as a man, right? And it's they kind of come back,
Yeah.
and sadly, a lot of people in our society, like I didn't join the military, but my dad being in law enforcement, always shared stories about pretty horrific things that the world's an ugly place basically, and sometimes people don't necessarily know that if they don't have that experience with law enforcement or military. So, do you mind sharing any stories that particularly kind of shaped you?
Yeah, so Lee, I'm not going to go into detail because, some were horrific stories and that, but I think
Yeah.
more than anything, with people's lives, lives are precious, and often you saw where lives were expendable, often amongst the black people, not so much us, because, speaking personally, I didn't hurt anyone for that matter or shoot anyone. But we had to stop a lot of that from happening between the black people. There was what they called the third force, where it's a phenomenon where trouble was caused to incite violence between the two factions, if you want to call it, the two different, and you would see a lot of people being killed unnecessarily. For instance, if a certain guy had to go and shop at a shopping center that they were boycotting, and he was caught there, they would catch him, they would necklace him, which would put a burning tie around his neck, kill his family, things like that, and those are the things you had to try and stop. Um, but yeah, just seeing a lot of lives being expended for silly things, and it plays on a youngster's mind, when you see a lot of that happening. Um, guys who went to the border lost friends, me myself, I lost friends in those situations. Um, you know, so yeah, it was, I think let me leave it at that, Lee, because I mean I could go into detail of things I saw. Um, they were terrible, man. Just unnecessary killing, unnecessary hurting, for political reasons, eh? And sometimes, people fighting for specific causes that were different, even amongst themselves and the black people. And that was the sad thing because it was tough to be a black person in those days, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, something that I've come to learn is that the world's default is crime and war and fighting and not peace necessarily, right? And we've done
yeah,
our countries have done a lot of work over the past few hundred years to create societies of peace, right? So if I look around me, I'm in Southern California. It's a very privileged, clean, peaceful place. Of course, there's still crime in certain communities, but I think people really forget that having our freedom of speech and having strong law enforcement and right to property and innocent until proven guilty in our courts, like these are you know transformational things in terms of humanity. So when people
yeah,
always look and they say oh, the United States is racist and South Africa is just a bunch of colonizers taking advantage of weak people. It's like that. I don't agree with that narrative. I think the entire world's default has been war and expansion and colonization until really Western civilization put an end to slavery and America became independent. South Africa became independent from the United Kingdom. So like we have a taste of that, but we know better now. So I think it's just something that again, the silent majority knows and understands, but we just have to kind of speak it out loud and share it to the younger generation so
yeah.
they can understand that.
Yeah, I see the term colonizers is used quite a lot today, and I'm totally against that because, you know, fair enough, colonizers came. Um, I stay on the west coast of Cape Town here, and you see that beautiful Table Mountain. And one day when you come visit, I'll show it to you, Lee. And you kind of visualize. Sometimes I sit and I watch the sun setting here, and I visualize how those guys came around the corner on those huge ships of theirs and docked in at Cape Town and planted their flag. In those days, you would plant your flag. To kind of uh, it was just one of the things the guys did, plant your flag and kind of you've arrived, and that was the narrative, to say it was right or wrong. But if you look at the country today, South Africa, and it was built, and the infrastructure that's still supporting, that was built by the so-called colonizers, is still very much strong in the whole continent of Africa. Um, Here, South Africa itself, and that I'm proud of. I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of my ancestors who arrived here, and did what they did to make this country what it is, and that's why I fought for it. Um, and just to go back, I mentioned we were in the army, and there were a lot of terrible things that happened, but we were a military machine of note. Um, I'm
Seventh
talking in
strongest in the world, right?
Yeah, I'm talking in the 70s, from a guerrilla warfare perspective, we were a very, very strong country militarily, and we had structure. And we also were taught to respect life, not just kill, and we had to fight for what we believed we were fighting for, but we also just didn't go willy-nilly killing people. In many cases, we protected people, and personally, I can talk personally for that, um, but we were protecting an ideology that might not be right, but at the end of the day, we were brought up, to believe that was what we were doing was keeping the communists out and building our country to be the best we could be. The apartheid thing was totally wrong. There's no doubt about it. I wish we could have did things differently. But history is history, and history writes itself. Lee, and we learn from history, right? But we can't keep going on blaming the world for where we at. We've got to move on.
Yeah.
And that's you know look forward. I'm not, you know, yeah, it's simple as that, Lee. It's maybe people would disagree with me or whatever, and that's fine. But I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of what was achieved in South Africa, and sometimes it saddens me when I look at what's happened to this country. You know, since 1994, a lot of good things have happened, right? A lot of good things have happened. We mustn't forget that. But two, a lot of our infrastructure is going wayward. There's a lot of corruption in our governments. As the guys have taken over, and call it black governments because that's what it is. I want to refer to the black and white thing, but it is what it is. It's a lot of the black government that has taken over. The corruption has destroyed this country. We've had state capture. We've had all kinds of things, from a government that could have done so much more. From when Nelson Mandela took over, huge respect to the man because he could have done it so differently, but he came out. And while he came out, there was a peaceful transition. There was a government of national unity, and he avoided a civil war. I wouldn't say avoided. He was instrumental in ensuring that a civil war didn't happen in this country, which was very on the cards. With regards to where it was going. So there's a lot of positives about South Africa, but there's also some negatives where I look at, the corruption and how things have happened here. You've got black economic empowerment after 30 years of democracy. You've got like 7% of the population that still, after 30 years can't apply for certain jobs because they're white, or they can't play in certain sports teams because they're white. You've got youngsters, and that's why you've got a massive exodus of skills. All those universities, Stellenbosch, uh, Rand Afrikaans University, all of the universities in this country that were built, kind of, yeah, just going southward south with regards to a lot of the stuff that's happening there in those universities.
They almost
Um,
overcorrected, right? Like it started off as a
yeah,
very, peaceful, transition with Nelson Mandela. And then over time, you had some folks in that party that were using racial grievances, right? Saying, hey,
yeah,
well, we had apartheid for so long that, all
yeah,
the poverty and suffering around, is because
yeah,
of the consequences of apartheid. So we need to do more to redistribute
yeah,
power and wealth from the whites
yes,
to the
yes,
blacks. And in that process, it was really just a mechanism of control and taking power, right?
yeah,
That's kind of that Marxist narrative, right?
yeah, yeah. And there was a need for some transformation,
Yeah.
and I'm not discounting that or saying that was wrong, but because transformation was necessary, and there were some wrongs of the past that needed to be corrected. Okay, but you can't just start going, completely in the opposite direction. You know what I'm saying? And because the result of that has been us losing many, many skills. That's the point I wanted to make in this country
Mm-hmm.
to overseas. Many doctors and engineers and you name it. You look at Australia and New Zealand, the US, the UK. I mean, if you go and look at a rugby game that gets played in the UK, you've got a massive amount of South African supporters there because there's a massive community that has moved there, because of their lack of faith in the country and the government and what's happening in this country. My own son, has had to move because just from a job perspective and his future, you know, as a white youngster, he's limited. with regards to where he can go and how fast he can get there, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, you know, those challenges are there. We're 30 years down the line here now, you know, we 7% of the population. They still say, you know, they want land, but you know, what are they going to do with the land? You know, the farmers here farm the land. And as you
Yeah.
know, farming is a science. It's an art. It's a fashion. You don't just get land and start farming. You know, you got to understand what you're going to farm, how you're going to farm it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of those farms, you know, provide food and to other parts of the world and to this country, you know. And if you have this massive land distribution um, takeover, you know, what are those guys going to do with the land, you know? And where it's happened here and there, it's just gone south because the guys don't know how to farm. You know, you
Yeah.
can't just give somebody land. You know, you got to farm the land. You know, what are you going to do with the land or buy the land? You know, and then you know, there's a lot of farmers. There's probably more black-owned farms in South Africa now than white-owned farms, to be honest. But the
Yeah.
white-owned farms are still producing more of the food and the because they farm properly. You know, they farm mechanically and with scientific intent. You know, and how things are done. Um,
Yeah.
so so yeah, you know, I'm just reflecting on what I say because you know, Lee, I understand. You know, it's a very sensitive topic. It's you know, it can really escalate. You know, you might have another guy that's grown up in a different society here in South Africa that would disagree very much with me, or maybe would challenge me on some of the things I said, and that's fine. But I'm just talking from my heart and what I've experienced.
Yeah, and that's why I don't like to use labels, but I do tend to bring up the term Marxism quite a bit, right? Because here in America, especially being in California, we're an incredibly diverse society, right? Like being on the
Yeah,
coast, I have many black friends. There was a lot of black people that went to my high school and I grew up with, and we were taught, you cannot look at someone based on their skin color and determine if they're a good person, a bad person, smart,
so
stupid.
true.
You can't. So therefore, you shouldn't judge them based on their skin color, right? So that's kind of how I was brought up.
100%.
Yeah, and I know I know we've talked about it, and you agree. And I think where people are going wrong these days, when I talk about like overcorrection, they instead of like they specifically say you need to look at race because well, people with white skin color, their ancestors were historically oppressive towards people with dark skin color. So if we really want to level the playing field, we need to now start to discriminate against white people. And that's where you have, here in America, and I'm sure you guys have the same, but affirmative
Oh
action
yeah.
says like hey, well we there's more white people than black people going to university, so okay, well let's put affirmative action where a white person or an Asian person or Indian, they have to score 4 times as high as a black person to be equally as qualified to get in. So I call that discrimination against white people and Asian people, but the Marxists say no, that's justified. We actually need to do that to level the playing field and make it fair for these folks to, not suffer as much. So, it's a
You're on the
dangerous
button.
ideology. Yeah.
You're on the button, and that's exactly what's happening here. You're on the button, Lee. And you know what? They're not doing themselves any favors by doing that because they're actually making themselves worse.
Yeah.
Um, because things come easy, and there's a spirit of entitlement, you know, now all of a sudden, you know.
Yeah. You're lowering
Um,
the standard for them.
you're lowering the standards, you know, and you get an entitlement sort of attitude, you know, like, you know, oh, you know, fees must fall. We don't pay university fees, or we don't, you know, how the heck, you know, do you keep a university running if you're not going to pay fees, you know? Um,
Yeah.
so there's this entitlement kind of attitude, you know, and it sucks, to be honest. And
Yeah.
you know, just like you, I got lots of black friends, you know, and hey man, I love lots of black guys and people and ladies and yeah, you know, like really wonderful people, even in my community here, you know, that I touch with on a daily basis, you know. Um,
I'm sure a lot of them
wonderful
agree
people.
with you,
Yeah,
right?
and they do, and
They
a lot
don't,
of
they
them
don't want
share the
handouts.
concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of them share the concerns, you know, about their own kids and their own families here, you know. A lot of them share the concerns about their own families in the township. And that's why we've just had an election where things are changing rapidly, you know. And the African National Congress used to be like 70% of the vote. It's gone to 40, and they're not so-called governing the country anymore. But then we've got a guy like Julius Malema who basically is a radical rightist. He talks hatred all the time, anything that comes out of his mouth towards white people, and I mean, how do you move forward with somebody like that?
Yeah.
Um, those guys, the minute they start talking, the rand just starts dropping. The rand, the exchange rate, from an exchange rate perspective, because investors just start wanting to run for the hills.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a very strong communist influence amongst the far left wing here in this country as well, even in the African National Congress. Um, you had the Communist Party of South Africa that was very much a part of the African National Congress, the COSATU, the labor unions that are very much part of the African National Congress. Um, and and these guys share close ties with the likes of Putin and the Russians, okay, and the
Hmm.
Chinese. And why is that? Because the Chinese have been sponsoring them. The Chinese sponsor them from an election perspective, from a infrastructure building perspective, from a loaning money perspective. You've even seen South Africa taking a stand now against Palestine and that. And that's always been the narrative on the far left here.
The
Palestine,
racial
Omar
grievances.
Gaddafi, yeah, Omar Gaddafi, Palestine, Russia, China. They were supported in the old days. Other so-called terrorists that I mentioned to you that we were fighting, they were supported by those nations. That's why we did what we did, Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and one last comment I'll make, because I know the ANC, right? So I here in America basically have two major political parties, right? Your Democrat Party, which is your more left leaning, progressive, old school liberal, is how I say old school because they're not so liberal anymore. They're more extreme progressive and redistribution, which is illiberal. And then you have your more Republican Party, which is my preference, although I have many criticisms of them, but they're a little bit more traditional and a little bit more patriotic. But I see a lot of similarities between the Democrat Party and the ANC, where they were using these races of past racism and discrimination. And hey, that's the reason why we see disparate outcomes, right? So even if we don't discriminate against race going into university, we still see more white people getting accepted because they have better scores and they're doing better on the tests. And I say, okay, well, that's more of a problem with the communities in the Black communities of them maybe not doing their homework as much. There's a big issue with fatherlessness. So there's reasons why they're not scoring as high. But the left or the Democrat Party says, no, that's because of past racism. So if you vote for us and give us money, we will account for that and justify that and redistribute the wealth and all this. So it's the same kind of Marxist rhetoric that we see about like, hey,
yeah,
those on top with the power, we need to join together to take that power away from them and redistribute it. So so I see a lot of similarities where they were kind of using that as a mechanism
yeah,
to get voted for and stay in power, but it's all being exposed now as being maybe justified ideologically, but a lot of bullshit. And just like what you said about taking farmland away from white farmers who are actually producing food and using their skills to produce towards the economy, now you're going to take it away and give it to someone who doesn't have those skills. So that collapses your economy, maybe not immediately, but communism, which is kind of how I look at this, it destroys your society over the course of a couple decades, right? And correct me
yeah,
if I'm wrong, but we've kind of been seeing that in South Africa since the 90s, right?
yeah. You're on the button. You're on the button.
Yeah.
And yeah, so true, Lee. And many other aspects, Lee. You've got all these different movements and these left liberal movements that are creating all this hype and politically correctness about what a person says and what they can and what they can't say. The whole woke movement, the whole BLM movement. I mean, where in your life? I mean, really? I mean, can you imagine a WLM movement or a Asian Lives Matter movement or an Indian Lives?
Yeah.
You don't see that. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Everybody's lives matter, man. and why all of a sudden must black lives matter? Everybody's lives matter. White lives, Asian lives, you name it. We all one and the same.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden, I mean, and that narrative just teased me off. It just, a lot of people silently kind of just in the back end, like, yeah, I don't know, Lee. And then you get the media coverage, you get these big media houses in Hollywood and you name it, pushing their agendas here.
Yeah.
And that's where, I'm saying, like men like us need to stand up, and bring our children up like that. Because even a lot of my friends, and people I interact with, oh, don't say this, and it's all about being politically correct, and yeah, it's
Jordan Peterson, who I know we've chatted about before, he uses a term, white guilt. So, yes,
yeah,
there's a lot of black Marxists using this, narrative to gain power and build momentum, but there's also a lot of white folks who are like, hey, our ancestors were pretty bad. Like, let's just do what they say. You know what I mean? And then they kind of feed
yeah,
into it, and so, but there's accountability on both sides. But the way I see
yeah,
it is there's also black people that agree with us, and they're like, hey, like, yeah, the past was nasty, but my
yeah,
future is due to my own actions and responsibilities. And listen, if my
yeah,
mom can flee Vietnam with no money, nothing in her pocket, and come to this country and build wealth, get educated, retire, and now can visit Vietnam whenever she wants, then someone else, black or not, with $0 in their
mm,
pocket can bust their butt. Hey, if you got to work two jobs to go to community college and then go to a university and then get, or become a plumber and then become the best plumber that you can possibly be, that's the beauty of being in Western civilization, right? Like, we don't live under a communist rule, or at least traditionally. And that's what's the beauty of being in this country. So there's really no excuses to past discrimination and all this stuff. So, I totally agree.
yeah, truly, true.
So I am curious. I mentioned to you that, like, your military experience, I think a lot of young men can learn from, and me personally, like, one of the major goals with my podcast is I want to help young men become stronger, get their shit together. I don't know what the phrase is. Pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and kind of that traditional. It's like that's how my dad raised me. If I didn't do my homework, he'd kick my ass, right? And he would make sure
Yeah,
I did my homework and would make sure I wasn't breaking the law. Or, if I got in trouble for curfew, then he would punish me. So it's like we actually need this type of structure for young men. And, so again, part of my podcast is I'm bringing together responsible men to say, hey, these are some bad ideas. These are some good ideas. Here's how I, gain strength. So what would you say, like, in terms of skills you developed in the military, and also, like, you left South Africa with the military, you were in other countries, in Africa, correct? Like, what was that experience like? And,
so I mean, on our borders, we've got countries like Zimbabwe and Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, Mozambique, and countries like that, that were all colonized countries from the Portuguese and you name it, you had Portuguese, you had German, Southwest Africa, Namibia, and in
French.
Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, you had Britain. Um, and you had, those countries were colonized and, they were progressed. Okay. There was infrastructures that were built in them. You could say the same argument, if they weren't colonized, where would they be today?
Yeah.
Where would they be? Would they still be living in huts in the bush? I mean, I don't know, So, they love throwing that one at us, but in the same breath, Lee, the colonizers this and the colonizers that. But you're riding in the colonizers' cars they invented, the airplanes that are flying in the sky. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
you can throw that into the mix too if you want, But irrespective of that, I think, Lee, what I want to impart here more than anything is, I've got two children that I've brought up, and I come from a big family, and we love God, okay, in my family. And that's a very important part of our lives is being God-fearing. And what I mean by that is knowing the difference between right and wrong, okay, when you grow up. And also not only that, but being respectful towards others, I think is a great quality, that sometimes is lost today. simple thing, like when an old lady is standing and you're sitting in a bus to give her the seat. Now that might sound really simple, but that's respectful. That's respecting elderly people. Now, on the streets of London and things that are, you don't even get that happening anymore. They would laugh at it if you had to say that, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm using that just as a simple example, but there's so many other means of respect. And it doesn't matter the color of your skin. It's about respecting someone for who they are as a person, okay? And it's about being disciplined too in certain aspects of your life. And discipline is a strong word, but you just said to me, Lee, you're pressing on, you in your work from a sales perspective, you're doing your stuff, you're showing up each day, you're trying to improve, you're getting better as a youngster, and you have your sights that you're sitting on. And it takes a certain amount of discipline to do that, right? And just how your dad instilled that in you wanting to achieve. And just by doing what you're doing now, you're impacting others' lives by having these sort of discussions, and you patriotic about your country. You shared your mom's story, and that's a wonderful story to be able to share, because that just shows you can come from that and build it into something much better. And none of us, even my own parents, my mom grew up in quite a hectic environment. My uncles went to the Second World War at the age of 14 and bluffed their ages to be 16 to get on ships to be shipped to Egypt to fight against Hitler. So all these things, must not be forgotten. And it's about not forgetting those, but it's also about looking forward and not backwards all the time. And it's about how we can improve ourselves, and how we can just impact each other in a positive way. Lee, one of the things I try and do daily, and this is kind of my own mantra, is I try, and I'm just speaking for myself, but it's to encourage others to do the same, is I try and make somebody's life a little lighter each day. It doesn't matter where or who it is. It could be something small. It could be beggar on the side of the road, helping him with a cool drink or a sandwich. It could be something much bigger, seeing somebody battling out there with no job and helping them, or picking up somebody and giving them a lift on their way to work who are walking to work or something like that. Just making somebody's life a little lighter each day. And it's a wonderful principle, because I call it the principle of giving. And it just comes back tenfold, tenfold. And you don't give to receive. But I tell you, Lee, when you have a giving heart, and you have that principle, of being able to impact and help. And I learned that through, going through seeing all these tough things that I shared with you around the army, and you just appreciate life more and more. And we need to appreciate each other more and more. Because war, let me tell you, Lee, war is a terrible thing. And you see all these wars happening, and you see all these people dying, in Palestine, and you know, and yet again, you have all these people dying in the Sudan, you know, where the Muslims are killing hundreds of people, but you don't even get that on the media. Why? Why is that not on the media? What's happening in the Sudan? Hardly ever spoken about. It's been happening for years. Rwanda, where millions of people were killed. So, it's all, yes, man, it's this way this world is kind of wiring itself and where it's going, and we have to make a stand against things like that, and we have to make a stand about what we believe and what's right.
Yeah.
Saying it to a child, that they must decide what sex they are when they're six, are they male or female? I mean, come on, guys. I mean, what are we building here? We're destroying family units. And I go back to another important thing. You spoke about fatherless societies. And in the black communities, you've got so many fatherless children, and who have no direction. I always say there's a guy by the name of John Eldridge, in American, who wrote a book called The Way of the Wild Heart, and he speaks about a father's heart. And he speaks about a boy without a father is like an explorer without a map. Okay. And how true is that? You spoke about your dad. He was your map, right? He gave you some direction. And if you had a wonderful relationship with him, and it sounds like you did have a good relationship with your dad. And you look at guys who had good relationships with their dads, 9 times out of 10, they're good men. But where a dad was missing, what happens? You know, And it doesn't matter. It's a fact of life. A dad is there for a reason. Just like a mom is. She's just as important.
Yeah.
And and those are the things. Those are the principles that we got to stand by here. And I go back to God. It's not about having to go and sit in church every day. And I shared a bit with you around that, Lee, because I've got some real stories how God's impacted my life along the way, even in the army. And yeah, just being grateful for coming through all of that, and having a family that are, you know, it's something to aim towards as a young man. Have a family and you know bring up children that can be have a positive impact in the world, right? That's what we all want. And
Yeah.
when we're not giving our kids direction and we're confusing them with all this woke bullshit. Excuse for swearing there, but that's what I believe it is. Because it's just putting people in, it's giving them a direction, it's taking away fathers out of society, and yeah, I mean, I got the greatest respect for ladies too, for women. My own daughter, I bring her up to be independent, and you know, there's so many girls out there that could beat men in many things. And we must never ever discount that, because women have got a huge place in society, just like men have. But there's a reason they women, and there's a reason they men. You
Yeah.
know, there's
It's
a
been that way for
reason.
all of humanity.
Yes, and now you're faced with all this nonsense that a minority, are putting up all these banners all over cities and having all these, you know, what do you call them? Woke days and lesbian days. What about having a day for patriots? What about having a day for, you know, um, what about having a day for, yeah, you know what I mean, Lee?
Yeah.
And then we'd be frowned upon if we're going to have such a day. In the meantime, the majority of us are those people, and we're too afraid to stand up and be counted. And
Yeah.
so hats off to you, Lee, too, as a young man doing what you're doing. I really respect that. And keep doing what you're doing, Lee. And
Yeah.
hopefully I've imparted something by just saying what I'm saying. I'm just talking from the heart here, Lee. Um, yeah, the military, I believe, was a good thing for me. It taught me discipline. It taught me how to get on with other men. It taught me to push through when I thought I couldn't. We did some tough things, with regards to pushing the limits, um, in our minds, in our emotions, in our physical strength. And it just makes you a better man when you go through trials like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I think that is something that society is teaching less these days is building strength and autonomy to the younger generation, right? And
yeah,
Jordan Peterson again, him and another psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, he wrote a book, "The Coddling of the American Mind," talks about how we're coddling our children now, especially I was born in '97, but they say that folks born '95 and after there was the era of the helicopter parents, right? Doing everything for their kids. Kids are getting fatter. They don't go
yeah,
outside and play on their bicycles anymore. They can't scrape their knee. And Jordan Peterson talks about how parents these days, they want to be friends with their kids first instead of being a parent. But I actually think it's the other
yeah,
way around, right? Like my parents were strict with me. Like I love my parents. We have a great relationship. We're best friends right now. Growing up, they were really strict with me, and I'm glad that they did it. And there was a period of time, after I left the nest and figured out how to pay my bills and pay rent and go get a job and
yeah,
learn how to deal with getting fired and all that. Once I got myself together as a man, I was able to now I voluntarily spend time with my parents. Right, it's not a chore. I choose
yeah,
to spend time with them, but they were strict with me first, and now we're friends. Versus nowadays,
yeah.
some parents just want to be friends with their kids and want their kids to like them, but you got to teach them right from wrong, right?
Oh, and there are no boundaries. What I'm hearing you say when you use the word strict, it's almost like my folks were also strict, or wouldn't say overly strict, but there was respect. My dad set boundaries.
Yeah,
Like I'm sure your mom and dad did. And you can take child discipline to another level. You get guys that go overboard. But at the end of the day, You want to set boundaries for your kids, and especially in those minor years from 2 to 7. It's the simple principles of respect and gratefulness and respect for elders. Hard being, what a hard work is. Being able to
Yeah,
do something with your own hands, dig a hole in the garden or drill a hole in a wall. How many kids today can't even do that? You know,
a lot. Yeah,
you know,
yeah, it's true. And even like, like these days, I can change the oil in my car. There's a lot of stuff my dad taught me. I'm by no means, as capable as he is in terms of using his
yeah,
hands and fixing a pipe and all that stuff. So, that's another thing I agree with. But there was one thing you mentioned earlier with, having the ability to speak up and speak your mind, right? And Jordan Peterson again, and I'm big on psychology, and so is he. He's a psychologist, but he also talks about totalitarianism, right? So he spent his early career studying why did Nazis, kill pregnant women? Why were Nazis doing this? Why were the Russians sending their own people to gulags, right? And when you live in a totalitarian state, people are so afraid to speak their mind, even if they know it to be true. So it's like, okay, for example, today, there's two biological sexes, right? Your chromosomes XXXY. Everyone knows that. However, and that's correct. But if you say that out loud, someone will say, hey, even though that's correct, like Lee, don't say that. That's not politically correct. And now we're getting into a zone of, just like you said, political correctness is actually a communist term. And Jordan Peterson says, your society is starting to decline when people can't even speak what they know to be true out loud because they're going to be
yes,
criticized or shunned by society,
yes.
canceled, by society. So it's
Yeah,
like
keep
these are all
quiet, don't say anything, you
yeah,
know?
and it's like these are all, they claim to be progressive, but these are old dead ideas that we've seen before, and they slipped all these major. I mean, Germany was one of the most powerful advanced countries in the world. How did they get infected by this idea
Yeah,
of the Jews taking over and owning everything, and we need to stand up and all this? It's like Marxism has been tried before. It has led to horrific catastrophes. And history shows the only way to fight it is for the silent majority to not be silent anymore and to actually speak
yeah,
up and say, no, I know that there's two
yeah,
sexes. I'm not gonna accept, this bullshit that you're pushing.
yeah, and it's religion too that often causes major issues. Like, I mean, from a Muslim perspective, if I was just watching on the news now, where you have the right wing in France kind of seem to be growing, and they don't want them to wear the burqa or that around their heads or whatever. And then, when people say that, all of a sudden, they're wrong and they this and that. You should be able to say what you want to say. If you don't believe that's right and how they're treating women in that religion, you should be able to say it, because you can say it against Christianity nowadays, you
Yeah.
know. And those are the things we got to be aware of, those are the things, that are creeping into our society, where, you can't say certain things, and those are the red flags I think we have to be aware of, like what's happening from a worldwide perspective, um, in certain religions, say.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, here in America, like one, we had 9/11 back in the day, right? These were radical Islamic groups who hated America. They hated Western civilization. And they use the Marxist narrative where they say, hey, all this poverty around us in the Middle East is because of Westerners, right? Just like folks in Gaza, right? Like I
Yeah,
have Palestinian friends. I, of course, want the best for Palestinian people, but I'm willing to accept that Hamas is a terrorist group that is oppressing their own people and then blaming the Jews or blaming Israel for all the suffering in their community, and then people are fucking buying it. Like again, when I
yeah,
when I say like your white guilt, we have our elite, more usually white, usually college educated women who are saying like, no, America is bad. Like, no, America is the only reason we're powerful is because we exploited other countries. And Israel, look, Israel has iPhones and running water, and they have gay people, and they have music festivals. Like they're only wealthy because they're exploiting the surrounding nations, and it's a bunch of bullshit. But why are people believing it? It's because of this Marxist narrative, right? So for
It's
me, I
Marxist
get very
narrative. That's
fearful.
yeah.
Go
It's
ahead.
shoved down our throats. Shoved down our throats. And
Yeah,
everything we see, it's in the media, and the media are the biggest threat in that regard.
yeah. And it scares me because, here in America, I would hate for like the beauty of America, you could be any fucking religion you want, right? Like I can have a Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, and we all go to school. We all love being American. I see less of that these days, right? It's very tribal. What scares me is when you have 5, 10-year-old young Muslim kids here in America, and all day they're just bombarded with this information of, oh, well, look, my parents were exploited by Western countries. Like, oh, America has always been bombing our countries. Like, what? I hate America. Like, yeah, me and my fellow Muslims, like, we're going to stand up and go blow up this, school over here, or we're going to go incite a riot over here, or go attack a synagogue. It's like, that's really dangerous, this tribalism. And psychologists say that humans, the default is tribalism, right? And so we need to, I mean, again, like that's why we should be grateful for Western civilization, because we've exceeded that. We know that you can't look at someone based on their skin color or religion and determine if they're good or bad. So why are we doing that? So it really has been just slipping us back into this tribal warfare where whites now hate blacks. All like we're starting to get more racial division these days. So it's something that scares me, and I
Yeah,
hope
because
that
it's
we could
thrown at
have
us.
more people speak up against it.
Yeah, because it's thrown at us with all this BLM stuff, and like generally, yeah, just it pees me off, pees me off.
Yeah. And one of the main pillars of my podcast is it doesn't matter your skin color or religion. Hey, if you want a better future for our society, then let's have dialogue. Like we have to be talking amongst one another. And it's bad if I can't even, sit at the dinner table and talk to a family member who's progressive because they just don't want to talk, or they just shut down the conversation. That's not healthy, right? Like we need to be able to find,
That's not healthy.
we need to be
That's
able to
not
find
healthy.
common ground. Yeah.
That's not healthy. And the thing is, Lee, how are we going to change that? The thing is because the world's on this route, and how are we going to change that? How are we going to get more Jordan Petersons out there? How are we going to, how we, because you know what, Lee, one day, I'm getting on now, I'm 57, right? You're a young man and you're going to have kids, and they're going to have kids, and my kids are going to have kids. And one day we're going to have to answer and say to our grandkids, when our grandkids say, how did you let this happen? How did you let this happen to us? Um, I spoke to a young girl from the Netherlands, and I was asking her about the state that, the Islam influence there and what's happening right around them. Totally oblivious. Like when I mentioned that to her, like totally oblivious, like really? Is this happening in my country? I said, and when I said to her, one day your kids are going to ask you, well, how did you let this happen to us? And then she, it worried her the whole night. The next morning, she kind of reflected and said, what I said had held some weight, because if they
Yeah.
don't do anything about it, they won't have a country anymore.
Yeah. There's I just did a post on her on my podcast Instagram, but her name is Ayan Hirsi Ali. I don't know if you've heard of her before, but she was born in Somalia, raised in a very, kind of
Yes,
extreme Islamic
I've,
community. You've heard of her?
I've heard of her, and I've actually read some of her stuff.
Yeah, I love her content, and
Love
there's
her
even some
content.
there's some I always say that it's us against the woke, here in America, and us, you could be on the left or the right, you could be Democrat or Republican, but you know that you don't like the woke, which is more the radical leftist. But so a lot of these anti-woke folks talk about how, who do we want in our society the most right now are folks who came from these kind of more radicalized communities and then are now reformed, and they know that, hey, where I came from, they wanted, death, and they wanted violence, and they wanted to
Yes,
oppress women, and I came from that world, and now I don't support that anymore. So we need people like that to speak up, and that's why I like Ayan Hirsi Ali, because she can cite everything in the Quran. She can tell you all the ideas that
yeah,
she was taught, and tell you which ones are good and which ones are dangerous, right? And so she's been a very loud advocate and voice for, defending Western civilization and saying, like, I can do whatever I want now. Like, I have freedom. I can go get educated. I can go do this. I can go do that. I can drive. Like, this is a better way of life. Like, if there's any apartheid that exists today, it's the gender apartheid in the
Yeah,
Muslim world, right? So I love
yeah,
her stuff, and I really recommend people take a look at, even listen to her podcast, or she just did
yeah.
with
I've
one with
I've
Jordan
listened to it.
Peterson.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love this stuff. I love this stuff, and she's on the button, but she's also been shut down a bit, and a lot of her stuff doesn't get out there. Um,
yeah.
but um, but yeah, Lee, that's what we got to stand up. We got to stand up and in those conversations, not be afraid to say what we want to say, because we have a voice as well, and we
Courage is
we need to make
contagious.
courage is contagious,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
Cool, man, Lee.
Awesome, man. Well, I guess maybe a good spot to wrap up. And I've enjoyed the conversation. Truly, I'm incredibly appreciative and grateful. And I think, like, us just doing this, even if a few people watch it, inspires them to speak up and inspires them to not, not stay
Yeah.
silent in moments like this. But one thing I wanted to ask, and it's kind of a good spot to end, is on a positive note, what are you grateful for or looking forward to or optimistic about for the future of South Africa, and, the communities?
So I'm grateful, man. We live in a wonderful country here, man. We have so much diversity. We have so much diversity in people. Um, and it's a wonderful country. It's a warm country, People have soul, black, white, Indian, Asian, you name it. There's people with soul here, And that's what I love about this country more than anything, the warmness of it. And I felt that when I was in America. I felt a warmness of people, Wherever I went, I had helpful people, helping me to find my way through the airport, helping me, simple things, just, chatting to people in the McDonald's or in the Starbucks or guys over the counter, just warm people, man. So, I just think I'm encouraged by the people in this country. And if I look what's happened in the last elections, we all want good for this country, we all want to progress. And you have those elements that sometimes, the ones who want the land and don't know what they're going to do with it, and the ones who speak hatred that spews out of their mouth. Those are things we need to shut down, and those are things we need to quell. And the more of us that are against that, the better. So, I'm positive about South Africa, you know, because there are people who are making a difference. There are people who are being heard. And in many instances, from an South Africa perspective, we're not as far down the line on all this woke stuff, and not as easily influenced by it yet. But yet it's knocking on our door, and it's being opened. And that is a worry. That is a worry. But ultimately, we still have good principles in this country. We have a God-fearing mindset, I believe, in many instances. And yeah, Lee, I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for my children. I'm grateful that I can have an impact on people's lives every day, which I try and do in a positive way. And that's what living's about, right? And I just want to leave the thought with the principle of giving. The principle of giving is just a wonderful thing. Um, and it's wonderful to give of your time, whatever it is. Giving is just a wonderful principle. And my mother taught me that. And it just uh, it just makes life much more worth living.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think we're at an interesting time in our world right now. I'm happy for you and the rest of South Africa that, the ANC is not in power anymore, and that at least is
Yeah,
a sign for positive change. And, I think we just had we have our elections coming up in November, and just had a big debate that was, kind of worldwide, and people were talking about. So, based on that, I'm feeling optimistic, but, I don't want to don't want to accept a success or win just yet. So we still have a few months until the election comes, but I think that'll be a big turning point, hopefully, for all this woke
Yeah,
stuff and all
yeah,
that.
I'm watching that closely. I'm watching that closely, and it's funny, you guys have only got two players there, Um, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I've been reminding people, with the United States is the most powerful country. So if we have good leadership, the rest of the world tends to look a little better, and if we have weak, dangerous leadership, the rest of the world starts to look a little worse. So I encourage people to
so
go
right,
vote
man.
this year. Yeah,
And you guys are a great country. You are a great country, man. And I love coming there, and I want to come there again. And yeah, it's I'm just hoping that that election is the right turnout and for you guys, because I believe it's going to be massive, the impact on whatever happens there.
yeah.
For all of us
Well,
in the world, for all of us in the world. Not only you guys, we need it in the world. We need the right person to come through there.
yeah, totally agree. Well, Leaps, I appreciate it, man.
Cool,
This is a
man.
great discussion. I hope we can do another. I learn a lot
Yeah,
every time
thanks, Lee.
I talk to you, and like I said, I see a lot of similarities between you and my dad. I think like older men like you, the world really freaking needs right now to teach us right from wrong and to share experiences and remind us that we're
Yeah,
doing the right stuff. So I appreciate you, brother.
yeah, thanks, Lee. And in the same breath, we learn from the youngsters like you. It doesn't mean we can't learn. We learn because you guys bring new thinking, you bring freshness, you bring new perspective, and we learn from you guys just as much. So it's a two-way thing. And I say it, steel sharpens steel. I call it steel sharpens steel sessions. When we can sit with each other and we can reflect and sharpen each other to get better, man.
Yeah.
Sometimes.